Time now for a check of the top business news stories. Kate Moody is here, our business editor. Hi there, Kate.
Hi,
all eyes on the development and rollout of COVID-19 vaccines all around the world. And you've got a report now about the cost of unequal distribution of those vaccines.
Yeah, that phenomenon that's known as vaccine nationalism, which sees developed richer countries get access to the vaccine long before developing economies do. Now, it poses an ethical, moral quandary, which many organizations are trying to address, but it could also come at a huge economic cost, according to a new report commissioned by the International Chamber of Commerce, which underscores the degree to which the global economy is now connected and interdependent. In the most extreme scenario, which would see poor nations largely left out of the vaccine rollout in 2021, the report says the global economy would suffer losses of over $9 trillion. Half of that would be shouldered by the richest countries, despite benefiting more from the vaccine. The report further highlights a funding gap of over $27 billion to ensure equal distribution and says it would generate returns of 166% of that investment if it were met. Well, to talk us through those findings, we can speak now to John Denton, the Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for joining us on France 24 this evening. Help us, if you will, understand just how those numbers were reached. Is this mostly linked to the impact on global supply chains?
Well, what's happened, and this is one of the challenges here, in putting together the initial forecasts about global impact, what people forgot was the very point you made in the introduction, is how interconnected the global economy actually is. And so there's a whack both on export and on domestic economy and the operation of domestic economies by a failure to actually ensure equitable distribution of vaccines and also the therapeutics. And so what you're seeing over the life of this year is a failure to ensure equitable distribution. We'll actually have a top dollar hit of $9 trillion, and that's actually a study that was done before we saw the exacerbated impact of the new strains of the virus coming through, and 50% of that is going to be borne by rich countries. And so this kind of crazy notion that in order to support the equitable distribution, it's somehow an act of charity by rich countries to poor countries is absolute nonsense. It's absolutely in the economic common sense to do so. Because, for example, if you look at all the stimulus packages running around, if you want to ensure there's durable impact, you've got to make certain those supply chains are operating and the economies are operating in developed countries, which at the moment are out of the reach of access to the vaccine. Otherwise, you have a direct line back, not to Wall Street or to the CAC 40, it actually goes straight to the main street and actually to the service workers, say in France, in restaurants and cafes, in putting together bits and pieces in order to make supply chains operate. Their suffering will be exacerbated. They're being doubled down on. So we call on developed countries to stop seeing this as an act of charity and burying it away with small amounts of money. Fund the $28 billion. If you look at the amount of money the European Union's giving to the Reconstruction Fund, over $800 billion. If you look at the $1.3 trillion that President Biden's talking about for stimulus, this is a tiny amount. So European nations need to step up. France needs to step up. Australia, I'm an Australian, needs to step up. Canada and Japan. And it's good to see the US back in the game, but they actually have to actually increase their allocation if they want to see a better investment for their own economic recovery. And the same thing for Europe.
John, how would you judge the vaccine rollout so far across the globe? We know that the doses aren't being distributed equally here. What scenario are we heading for?
Well, it's pretty mixed. What we're trying to avert, and this is why the ICC will be launching a global campaign on this as well during the course of the next 10 days. We want to avert the kind of collapse in the supply chain to support the vaccine, which we saw with the PEP disaster and ventilator disaster in the first tranche of COVID-19, where governments contorted supply chains, and governments did not involve the private sector in sorting facilitation to distribute. And the biggest issue we're seeing underpinning all this is not just the order with which the distribution is occurring, it's the actual production. I don't know if you've heard today what's happening in the UK, but whilst their trajectory seems strong, they're actually now running up against production constraints. So we need to ensure that there's appropriate investment in the production to enable these vaccines and vaccinations to be, first of all, made and then distributed. And that requires actually engaging with the private sector, which is not something governments are often comfortable with. But that was the first lesson that was learnt in COVID-19, when the collapse of the PEP and ventilators, when the private sector effectively stepped in to sort that out. And they need to have the same intimate relationship. You can't have a national vaccination plan without fully engaging the private sector. And that needs to happen in Europe, it needs to happen in the developing world, and it needs to happen in the Americas as well.
John, you mentioned that plea, really, for governments to contribute more to these international efforts. The report saying there's a $27 billion shortfall in funding for programs like the ACT Accelerator, like the COVAX program. Are you getting any response from wealthy nations, apart from the Biden administration saying they are ready to contribute? Are you hearing more contributions here?
Well, I think the benefit of this report is it's like slapping someone in the face with a piece of wood. It's woken them up. The kind of excuse that, oh, well, we've given what we can out of our development budget, and of course that's producing anyway, is actually a nonsense, because this is an economic issue. We wrote this with the report, and we were not certain. Our hypothesis was borne out by the report, but we wrote this report for finance ministers and leaders. This is an economic decision that needs to be made, and this is something we'll be taking to the G20 as well. So, yes, it is good to see the Biden administration to come back in, and of course that offers leadership. But by the way, China needs to step up. Japan needs to step up. Australia, there's lots of countries that need to step up here. And I think what they've got now and what we provided them is actually the economic logic which they can use to make the case in their own domestic economies as to why this is money not given away in charity, but this is money investing in the future of the economies and getting people's livelihoods back operating and ensuring that the money they're given and the big amounts of money that they promise in terms of surplus are not frittered away, that they're actually durable. Because if you don't have a functioning global market here, as we've identified in this, then you're not going to be able to survive. You can't get through the pandemic on your own. You need to bring everyone together. Some form of solidarity needs to be evidenced here.
John Denton of the ICC, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks so much for joining us on France 24. There you go, Tom. The funding of wealthy nations, not just an act of generosity, but an act of investment. A pretty stark call there from the ICC.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that. Our business editor, Kate Moody, thank you so much. That's it from me. I'll be back in 3 minutes. Stay with us.